Thank you, Amy. And I get the great honor of welcoming our guest today, Reverend Billy Michael Honor. It's nice to see you in person. We're so, well, not in person, but as in person as it gets these days. We are so happy to have you as our special guest speaker today. And I just wanted to share a little bit about who Billy Michael Honor is. Billy Michael Honor is a public scholar and civic organizer whose progressive and compelling insights have made him a sought-after lecturer and social commenter. Billy is currently the Religion and Racial Justice Fellow with Aspen Institute's Inclusive America Project. And some of us at CTS have worked with Inclusive America Project, and we're familiar with that. In this role, Billy researches, writes, and convenes conversations about the importance of religious pluralism in the fight for racial equity and justice. And prior to joining Aspen, Billy was the director of faith organizing for the New Georgia Project, which some of us may recognize the name, founded by noted politician Stacey Abrams. And in this position, Billy mobilized faith communities to break the chains of injustice through organized civic engagement. The Center for American Progress named Billy one of the 20 faith leaders in the nation to watch in 2020. So now we get to watch him here in 2021. He comes to us live from Atlanta. Welcome, Reverend Billy Honor.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the invitation. Thank you for the introduction, Kim. Thank you, President Ray, for also allowing me to be here. And thank you to all of you for taking up this time to be together during this lunch hour here. I know very well the legacy of the Chicago Theological Seminary. So many people who I know who have matriculated through the wonderful institution, or who are currently matriculating as doctoral students or MDiv students. And so your legacy is strong, and I appreciate y'all. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the contribution that you're making to the church and the broader world. Whether you know it or not, you are making a difference in places that you can't always see or even feel, just in the way in which you all do your work and are rooted in justice and the pursuit of truth. And so thank you, and keep it up. Today, I just wanted to share some reflections. I was told that this isn't a lecture, and it's also not a sermon. And so what we'll try to do is we'll try not to be as formal as a lecture and as preachy as a sermon, which basically means I won't take up an offering or have an altar call at the end as a free. But no, but seriously, I really am appreciative for this time of reflection and to share reflections, because I have been thinking a lot over the last really few months, for really 3 or 4 years, pretty steady. I was really, really, really busy and engaged in this work of trying to build a progressive faith-based network in the state of Georgia around civic engagement and social justice. And we worked really hard for a lot of years to build that network. And it wasn't a lot of time to sit. If you've ever been involved in the work of organizing, then what you know is that you go from one battle to the next and one battle to the next. And then sometimes you're in a series of battles all at one time. And you don't often have the opportunity to sit and be reflective and to think about what it is we're building towards, what community we're trying to be together, what's beloved in community, and to really think about what is justice, what are the implications of the ways in which we are organizing ourselves. And so since really the beginning of December, I've had a lot of time to do that coming out of the November election. We had a runoff here. Some of you all may have heard about it here in Georgia. And Reverend Raphael Warnock has been a long colleague of mine, and we've worked on a lot of things together. And so I was consulting about some of the things happening around that, but was in a period of deep reflection, though, about the work we'd done and sort of what we saw happening in our country. And I want to sort of share a bit about that. For the last month and a half, I've had the opportunity to, as mentioned, to think with my good colleagues and friends at the Inclusive America Project of the Aspen Institute, who for several years have been thinking about how religious pluralism and how our religious traditions actually contribute to the common good of our country. I think it's an assumption that some of us make Whether it's a founded assumption is another thing. I think we assume it, but part of it is really thinking through the ways in which that's true. And then, of course, in that pursuit, you find the ways in which it's also not true. And so I've had the opportunity to think about that as well, in addition to some of the other things that I've been thinking about. And so what I wanted to talk today with you, and hopefully this will be a discussion, because as my grandmother, I was raised by my great grandmother in Orlando, Florida. Her name was Minnie Lee. Right. And Minnie Lee, one of the things she used to say in our home, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a little bit. But one of the many wise sayings she used to say to me was, all the sense ain't in one head. And she used to say that all the time as a way of talking about the fact that there's wisdom in the multitude of counsel. And so I would hope that as we discuss together, I think we can learn from one another a lot about what I want to talk about today. And that is, I really feel as though, and I felt this way deeply since last summer. Yesterday, as some of you may remember, was a year since a gentleman by the name of Ahmaud Arbery was killed, murdered, I would say. He was jogging in a South Georgia neighborhood in Glenn County, and some gentlemen were concerned because he was, I guess as he was jogging, he was looking into some homes that were around that were being built, and they tried to do what is called here a citizen's arrest, allegedly, which also is a law that was successfully overturned just last week here in Georgia. As a result of a year of advocacy, this law that I'm talking about no longer exists, because good friends of mine at the NAACP and the Southern Center and others worked really hard to say that it was a law, a relic really from the Civil War era, that was no longer needful. And what basically citizen's arrest said is that if you as a citizen see someone you think is committing a crime, you yourself can take it upon yourself to go and try to stop them until and question them about what they're doing until law enforcement arrives. Which, of course, some of you already know why that's just a stupid idea, just a horrible idea, especially in modern times. But it was still on the books, and so these individuals, this is what they said, or at least what the law enforcement said they were attempting to do. Of course, he didn't understand or respect whatever authority they were trying to render. And so he was not complying, and it ended up with them shooting him, and he ended up being killed. This was 5 or so months before, obviously, George Floyd's death. And then, of course, here, Rashad Robinson, who you might remember here in Atlanta, was also shot by the police in the back at a Wendy's, where he was sleeping in his car and they were trying to figure out why, and then he started running. So all 3 of these things happened, February, May, and then June. This spurred, as you know, protests all over the country, certainly here in Georgia. And I remember being at one particular protest that was happening here in Atlanta. And what was interesting about it is it was by the AME Church, who they asked me to help them organize it, and I did. And I was standing there looking at these individuals, and this is a sea of people who are protesting what they perceive to be anti-Black violence in the midst of a pandemic, right? Like, they put their lives at risk, like literally, to come out, because this is at the high moments of COVID-19. So people out here, and they have on masks, they're sanitizing, they're trying to social distance. And I realized that all at one time, we are dealing with a pandemic, which is pushing us to rethink so many things about our country and the way in which we are collectively organizing our lives together, exposing some of the deep inefficiencies of the system as it relates to its care for the most vulnerable, while at the same time also dealing with these long-time issues of racial injustice and the ways in which we have failed to have a great reckoning around the ways in which anti-Black violence still persists. And we were doing this all at one time. And I realized that perhaps more so than any other time, in probably any of our lifetimes. We were pushed because of this pandemic, and because of what was happening with this racial reckoning. We were pushed into a moment where now we are really trying to think about the reshaping of America in so many ways. If you don't believe me, think about the fact that right now we're having conversations about raising the minimum wage to either $11 or $15 an hour federally. We're having a conversation, I don't know where it'll go. At least it's a conversation around student loan debt cancellation, actually having that conversation, having conversations around hearings around a new John Lewis Voting Rights Act. All of these things would not be happening, right, if we weren't in the midst of a serious reshaping of America, or at least a pushing for there to be a reshaping, right? And it's the result of both of the things that I talked about happening, right? It's the result of people getting in the streets, and it's the result of COVID in the air. And it's the result of COVID being among the community and bringing about 500,000 deaths almost. So it raises the question, what then does religion have to say in this moment of the reshaping of America, right? What role does religion play? I think about Reinhold Niebuhr's very first book that he wrote. People talk about the nature and destiny of man, moral side, but they don't remember, does civilization need religion, which was the very first book that he ever wrote. And part of what he was arguing in that book was what is the place of religion in sort of this sort of modern industrial society that's rising up? Like, is it needed? And if it is, why? And it does push me to ask the question, what is the role of faith in this present moment, in this reshaping of America, this racial reckoning moment that many of us have been pushing for? And it's a really interesting question, because if you read the headlines, as I have read, then what you know is that the United States of America, according to the Pew study that was done, coming through this pandemic, citizens here in the United States of America have a stronger belief in faith as coming through this than any other country in the world. Any other country in the world. The Americans say that this pandemic has strengthened their faith at a higher rate than any other country in the world, right? And it's really fascinating, because a lot of these numbers have to do with, you guessed it, white evangelicals. White evangelicals have come through this and say their faith is stronger coming through this pandemic and coming through all the things that have happened with racial reckoning. It's also true that Black American faith has maintained its strength. It hasn't become more, it hasn't become less. It's pretty much stayed the same. And then, of course, other racial groups have had their not quite as precipitous, but they've also had their steadying of faith. And so when you see the idea that faith in the United States of America is strong through this pandemic, then it raises the question then, not only what is the role, but what is the nature of faith in the midst of this, right? And I've been thinking a lot about this, because part of what I know is that for people who do the type of work that I do, and you all who do the work that you do will know this probably better than I, that the racism and race in the United States of America, and part of what this rethinking is pushing, has is founded in the theological presuppositions of many of our religious traditions. That is to say that we have been contributors in many ways to the America that we are trying to rethink, right? Which means that it is impossible to think about the role of faith in the rethinking of America without also thinking about our role in rethinking faith itself and our faith traditions, right? That we can't really rethink America without rethinking our approaches to faith and the ways in which we do the work of faith together, that the two go hand in hand. They are not separated. And because the two go hand in hand, I started thinking about my grandmother's kitchen table. My grandmother's kitchen table is the place I often think of when it is that I get frustrated and I get tired with certain parts of religious community and faith community. I remember my grandmother's kitchen table because I called my grandmother's kitchen table the place where they used to have the meeting after the meeting, right? So there was church, And then there was the meeting after church, right? And this is where all the saints, most of them were elderly and geriatric, and all would come over to the house, and they would eat fried chicken and collard greens and macaroni and cheese, and they would find community among themselves. So they went to church, and then after church, they would come to the place where they could really be free, right? Around this table. That's what I saw. They would sit around this table and they would talk about everything. I mean, they would talk about the message that was preached, how it resonate with them. They would talk about the things that happened. They would talk about the politics, the local civic things happening in the community. They would talk about what's going on in each other's lives. And the crazy part is, I would see where they had just shook the pastor's hand and said, "Hey, Reverend, it was good to see you, Reverend," and give him a hug. And then they would come to that table and they would tear him apart. I mean, I said, "You just gave him a hug." Like, but part of what I realized was happening there is that this table became a free space for people to bring their unabashed and unhid and unveiled selves to a table where they were accepted and where they were free, right? And it led me to believe that what really needed to happen is we needed more places in society and culture, like my grandmother's table, where people could engage in what they didn't know they were doing, was engaging in a form of community building and a form of religious criticism, right? Where they were able to say and give one another permission to speak against the powers that be there in a way that they were free, in ways they didn't feel that in other places. And they were free to disagree with one another. They didn't need wholesale agreement to be in fellowship. They understood that as a premise of their gathering, right? And I think that part of what needs to happen for all faith communities, mosques, synagogues, temples, and churches, need to become more invested in the process of creating these sort of kitchen table environments, spaces and places where people can really not only criticize the things happening in broader society and culture, but begin to criticize and be free spaces where we can think about our own judicatories, religious judicatories, and the way in which we govern ourselves. Who do we exclude? Because I think until we spend more time building free spaces, I like to call them sometimes laboratories of liberation, where people can think together about what does it really mean to be free? I mean, I go around and I when I do work with congregations, that's one of the questions I push them on is, have you pushed the people in your congregation to really think about what it really looks like? Because a lot of times we talk about freedom, but it's a lot harder to think about what practices of living freedom really look like. What does it really look like? And so to push people to have those type of free spaces like my grandmother's table. And so I think that's one of the roles. The other thing I'll say, and just to and to ask for forgiveness for those who have other religious traditions, but I want to center in Jesus a moment. There's a lot of Christians in the United States of America, and I think that I want to say a word about this because it's important to me, and that is that we have to center and start talking about Jesus not just in the traditional terms that we have, but as a community organizer. I think this is central, actually, to the work that is before us. Jesus was not just, as traditional theology says, prophet, priest, and king, or as traditional church says, the lily in the valley, the bright and morning star, the bridge over troubled water, the way out of no way. Like, all of those things are good. Like, I like it. I like it. Those are helpful at different times, right? But what was Jesus doing, though, right? It gets me back to Howard Thurman and Jesus and the Disinherited. Why do you think Dr. King walked around with Jesus and the Disinherited in his briefcase and in his pocket during the civil rights movement? It was because Thurman, picturing Jesus not simply as religious object, but as religious subject, situated Jesus as being a faith-rooted person who was providing his community with tools that they needed to survive what they were going through in terms of the injustice of the Greco-Roman culture, or as Thurman said, having their backs be thrust up against the wall, right? What do you do? What do you say to a people? What tools, creative tools, of faith do you give them to be able to navigate hatred and fear and all the things he talks about there? And I think what Thurman was categorizing there is what I like to call the work of being a community organizer. You see, Jesus was going around his community, empowering the least, the lost, the most vulnerable in society to catch a vision of a better way of living. He was organizing them and offered the oppressed community of his day to join him in the freedom fight to work for a vision of a better possibility for them. He was an organizer. Watch this. He built a team. He went and he searched among young people because most of these disciples were young people. He built a team of young people. He trained them for leadership. He was an organizer because he had what we call in organizing world one-on-ones. He was going around having one-on-one conversations with people in the community, asking them, well, how would you like to see this community better? Let me suggest it could be better in this way. He was calling out the conditions of their lives and saying that we need to ask harder questions of those who are powerful and in powerful positions. He was also like an organizer, uplifting the voices of humanity and the most vulnerable and publicly offering better ways to structure society. That's how I understand parables. He was calling for a new order. That's how I understand the reign of God. As an organizer, he was participating in the act of civic disobedience by going in the temple and raising awareness about the corrupt system that was in place. Like an organizer, he was arrested for disorderly conduct and disturbing the peace of Rome. Subsequently, he stood trial. We have protesters that are standing trial right here in Atlanta over protesting on the summer. Jesus was just like that. He stood trial as a political revolutionary. One of my dear mentors, Dr. Randy Bailey, a retired Hebrew scholar, talks about Jesus as a political revolutionary. Jesus is on trial as a political revolutionary at the hands of an insecure empire because his organizing is effective and so effective that they take notice. And then, as many movement leaders do, he's killed. He suffers the death, right, of the state for his organizing, right? But his organizing is so effective that the spirit moves among the women first of the movement, which is also very typical, moves among the women of the movement who keep it going. They keep supporting the work, so much so that eventually the same empire that killed Jesus died, but his movement still lives because his organizing was effective, right? What I'm saying to you is that Jesus, in many ways, I could say the same thing if I had time about Muhammad. I could say the same thing about many of the other venerable figures in other religious traditions. Was an organizer. And we have to begin to center that as congregations once again in the reshaping of America. Because when we do, we give our congregations the tools that they need to be able to identify issues that they want to change and to begin to see and push together for what that change looks like. Finally, and I'm done, I think about the 1988 film, Spike Lee joint called School Days. Some of you may have seen School Days. It's a great film based about an HBCU called Mission College. And it's a sororities battling and fraternities battling one another doing homecoming. Some of you may know a little bit about that, right? And what I always think about in this film is not only do faith communities need to be like kitchen table environments like my grandmother's, and not only do they need to center the importance of community organizing in the rethinking and reshaping of America and themselves, but they also need to be voices that ask for the people and call for America to wake up. And in this film, in School Days, there's a conversation happening the whole film about divestment. The school needs to divest is what one of the activists who goes to the school wants them to do, but nobody's listening to him. And the really interesting thing is that this film deals with a lot of the issues that we're still dealing with today. Colorism, elitism, classism, political engagement or lack thereof, lack of social mobility, and even the politics of hair texture. The film is dealing with all of these things, right? But at the end of the film, when everybody's asleep, having had a good time at homecoming, the morning after, this activist comes and he goes out into the yard and starts ringing the bell, waking everybody up like 5:36 in the morning. Everybody's coming outside like, what's going on? And all he's doing is standing there by the bell yelling, "Wake up," yelling, "Wake up," saying it over and over again, ringing the bell. And people finally start to get it. In that moment, they get it. They get it. And they understand what's at stake and what the cost is. And I think that's what our faith communities and faith traditions have to join together to do. Join together to do in a great multi-faith way, is become beacons and voices that yell together. It's time for us to wake up. It's time for us to wake up and finally deal with the issues that have been keeping America from being as good as its promise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was good. That was good. In my part of the church world, we would have said something like, you just said a word there. So that was good. So appreciate that. So I just have a couple of thoughts I want to ask you, and just for your thoughts. And one is, in the struggle to build a new world, we use the language of abolition, we use the language of emancipation, and the only reason those words have meaning is because the South lost the war. Right? So, I'm wondering, in terms of, as we think about what this struggle is the struggle to get free and to save those who don't want us to be free? Or is the struggle to get to be free and leave them in the hands of God for whatever that may mean?
No, I really appreciate your question. So it gets to the heart of a conversation I've been having, you've probably been having, President Ray, over the years, about what's really the liberation agenda. I wrote a piece recently for Aspen called "Black Religion: A New Agenda for Black Religion and Black Resistance," where I actually get to a bit of this. I couldn't really delve into it as much in 750 words, but I tried, in the sense that so this is the Lent season, and several years ago, I gave up for Lent talking to white people about racial reconciliation. That's what I decided I wanted to give up for Lent. And part of that's because I've been ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA, and because there's only 60,000 Black Presbyterians in the United States of America, which means you could put together the largest 3 mega churches in Atlanta and it'd be more members of all of them than there are Black Presbyterians in the United States of America, just to give it some context.
Mm-hmm.
So I was getting called on a whole lot to talk about racial reconciliation and how do we, get white folks to understand about racism, all this kind of stuff. And I finally hit a wall. And so for Lent, I said, I'm giving it up. I liked it so much, though, doing Lent. It was so spiritually uplifting for me that I continued to practice past Lent to this day. I do not talk about racial reconciliation at all among white groups. And part of that is because I don't feel it is my work to do. To your point, like, if there is a redemption to happen, what I say in the piece is that part has taken up too much of the liberation agenda, right? Of trying to convince, white people about racism and the importance of doing anti-racist work and trying to identify discrimination in mostly white spaces. That's important work that needs to be done. But that's not the work that I choose to do, and what I think many other folks who do this work need to be focused. What we need to be focused on is what you, the last option, which is, how do we build spaces that are free, that are truly rooted in liberation, right? So that we can push, for people to begin to think about what it means to live in these new realities, right? But what I found is that is the harder question. It is much easier to simply try to reform a space or be critical of spaces than it is to be generative and to create new spaces. But I definitely think that is the agenda of where we need to go.
So where do you think, and what are some of the tools for getting that imagination about what it means to be free? So let me tell you what I mean. When I talk with my friends students um, who are from other parts of the world. They can tell you what home looks like, and they can tell you how they approximate it here, right? But they can give you vivid stories. They can give you, palpable sense of what home looks like.
Yeah.
What do you do with folks who have always had home be a contested place that would rather that they weren't there,
Yeah.
i.e. Black folk in the United States,
Yeah.
and helping to build a kind of imagination that is palpable
Yeah.
so that people have something that they're going to when they get free? Because, it's one thing to get free and get off the plantation and find yourself in the swamp for the next 10, 15 years. And it's quite another thing to find yourself free so that you can build a farm, build a town, what have you.
Mhm.
But, in terms of imagination,
Yeah.
how do you do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, no, listen, this is the question I think we've been wrestling with for a long time. And it is the important one. I mean, I think this is some of what Charles Long is getting to in his work in terms of talking about the challenges of even talking about when studying Black religion and Black religion in America and Black religion in general is this idea of home, right? This loss, this lost home. Like what do you do as an exilic people, right? And I think so one for me, it goes back to what I was talking about in terms of creating these spaces of these laboratories for liberation, going back to where we actually give people the opportunity to think thoughts that they didn't know they had the freedom to think
Mhm.
in places of faith. So one of the resources for this, a lot of this work around Afrofuturism, right? This is why I think work like the Black Panther film was so, was such a phenomenon, because it was a bringing together, right, of ways that people hadn't really thought about before of what was possible, of using that imagination of science fiction, of using that imagination about how it is speculative fiction, if you will, the work of Octavia Butler and others, right? That gives us the ability to be able to conceive of realities that, hadn't been conceptualized before. And so I think creating free space for that type of work is one. And then the other thing I'll say is also, I mean, I think we have to have some different, we have to create some different vocabularies for religious language. I mean, this what becomes the great benefit of theological institutions, is they used to call it in preaching where I grew up, using my mind's eye, right? As I look through my mind's eye, like being able to create different, different vocabulary for how people even conceptualize the work that we're doing and the way in which we're being in community. So that's why I would say I think we need new vocabularies. I think we also need spaces that give people the freedom to do some of this this type of imaginative work.
Mhm. So this is the last question, then I'm going to open it up to folk in the room. But one of the big struggles that we have is that very many of the people who would be allies and who are allies are sort of challenged by the fact that the folks who showed up on January 6th are their cousins, are their fathers, or their uncles, or their aunts and their sisters.
Yeah.
And so the question, for me is, how do we create a movement so that we can give folks space to find a new identity? Because if they're really going to be about this work, they're likely to lose a lot of that. If they're really going to be about the work, right? If they're going to show up every now and then, then it's no big thing, because you can do that and just have a difficult conversation at Thanksgiving, right? But if it's going to be costly to
Yeah.
people, if it's going to be like that Jesus thing, when he said, when you put your hand to the plow, don't look back.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do we create the communities that we can support allies as they're going through the journey, while not consuming ourselves with their being saved in the journey as the point of the fight?
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. It's real, because so there's a cheap form of racial justice work, right? And the cheap form is the form that's only about showing up to the protest. You know, I used to once upon a time we would have some of these protests and some people would show up and we would tell them, you know, it's really nice for you to be here in this protest. We appreciate you being down here. Truth is, though, it would be better if you would take this protest like to Thanksgiving or to your boardroom or to your church, right? Like we appreciate the solidarity of being down here. It matters, but the real risk is taking it somewhere where you have something to lose, right? And divesting of not just whiteness, but divesting of Americanity. And I'm going to say another word, divesting of the caste mentality, right? It's very difficult for all of us. And so we need to start creating a post-caste, and I'm picking up on Isabella Wilkinson's book, Caste, a post-caste sort of communities, right? Where people who are really about this life, as we like to say, right? Who are really about this life, have community where they can come and where they can begin to work through these things as they go through the challenges of divestment, because it's very real, right? Because there's a grieving process that happens for all of us as we shed and divest of a part of much of what we've known to be reality, right? Like we all swim in this, right? It's all in us. Like nobody is immune to this, right? And this, so when I went to few years ago, I was in India. There was a consultation around, they were asking for Black theologians to come to work with the Dalit community in Southeast Asia and in Bangkok, in Thailand, and to just talk about tools that we've been using here and see how they would be transferable. The Black theologians who went over, if I call some of their names, you would know them. They were content to convince these Dalit Christians and these Indians that the problem is white supremacy. They were going to convince them of it, right? Like the problem is white supremacy. Like y'all don't understand. It was the white colonialists. Like this is the problem. And the Dalits were telling them, listen to us. Listen to what we're trying to tell you. The missionaries that came here were not the issue for us here in India. It is this caste system that was put in place when the Europeans finally did leave. It left other Indians like us who were in place, who put in this system, this caste system in place. That is the system, right? That is oppressing us right now, right? And I started to think, and I was really wrestling with this over the time, because I was doing more listening than talking. And this term cultural imperialism, right? Like I ran upon it and I realized that white supremacy is an outgrowth of a broader term of cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism being more insidious, and it gets to this idea of caste, which is not based in race, but it's based in the proclivity of humans to create human divisions, hierarchies of human division, right? And you know, forms of racism flow from it. And so the real thing to get to the core of is how do we get to what it is in us that wants to create community around hierarchies of human difference, right? Maybe based in class, it may be based in sex, it may be based, you know, in whatever, but that is what we really have to get to. And the only way we can do that is when people really get it and they really try to divest from that system. It's hard. And I think we need communities that are just rooted in that work that can support one another. That's a long answer, but I think I really want to say that because I think it's important.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. Let's take an opportunity now for the next 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more, to engage our speaker. So please, you can either ask questions in the chat, or if you want to simply jump in and ask a question. We'll do that for about the next 10 minutes or so. So please.
I did see somebody ask in the chat about who was the professor I mentioned. Someone answered. Thank you. I don't know who answered, but appreciate that. That was Dr. Oh, okay. Yeah, President Ray. That was Dr. Randall Bailey, retired professor at the Interdenominational Theological Center.
Yeah, very dear friend.
I would like to make a comment. I'm Marva Coleman, and I appreciate your insights so much today, Reverend Honor. Uh, I'd like to express my thoughts around our faith and togetherness. During the marches that we have seen, to me, I feel like that is a great demonstration of togetherness in this nation. We had the women come out during the women's marches and Black Lives Matters. And uh, we saw people come out for those marches, not just in almost every state in the United States, but also across the waters in other countries, Britain, Spain, etc. And I think the greatest demonstration of all was around uh, George Floyd. It was like the whole world was marching. So there is a togetherness in faith and ethnic groups. All ethnic groups participated in that. And to me, that togetherness was a divine event. I would say that more people experienced the death of George Floyd than those who witnessed Jesus crucified on the cross.
Mm.
As far as I'm concerned, George Floyd was a re-crucifixion of Jesus. As Cone says, each time a Black boy is shot down unarmed uh, for no particular reason, it's a re-crucified of Jesus. And this, to me, is our greatest threat today, is Black boys being shot down and cities willing to pay millions of dollars to the families rather than bringing that policeman to accountability. And it's time for us to realize that these police shootings are ethnic cleansing and genocide. Anytime a policeman can get out of a car and within so many seconds shoot a Black boy with no provocation, then that is an intent to kill. And it's time for us to change immunity uh, by legislation. And I think our togetherness in church and community, uh, white, Black, Asian, I think we're together on that. The big block or problem is our legislators. And I must say, our Republican legislators, they're blocking all movements towards bringing accountability to this issue of police brutality. And so I would like for you to say a little bit more about that. Uh, I just like to reiterate that I think George Floyd's death was a divine event, and it opened the eyes of people around the world. And I think people are ready for legislation on it. It's just those handful of conservatives and Republicans in our government that we have got to hold responsible for this. So I would like for you to make additional comments, if you will, and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for your question. I really appreciate it. I agree that George Floyd's um, George Floyd's murder was a seminal moment in what we saw in terms of the really a lot of the protests that really were already happening. As I mentioned with Ahmaud Arbery, there was already uprising around that in the country in some places. And so when George Floyd happened and people saw it, like the way in which the video came across, I think it just really created a wave of action that we're still feeling the ramifications for. So I agree with that. It's similar to the turning point of the civil rights movement was seeing on TV Bull Connor put the hoses on the children at the front of the line that they strategically had put at the front of the line in Birmingham. And so white audiences seeing that on TV, and that was a lot for them to see children treated in those ways. And so it's similar to that. I will say this though, I think like anything else, I do think that we obviously have a problems in terms of the legislative situation on all levels. And there's a whole lot that I could say don't have time to say about that. I think we all understand those problems. But I think we do have to be honest and talk about religious communities are as complicit in the ideas around policing and a lot of these police brutality issues as anybody else, because of the ways in which we've not wrestled with our own views on law and punishment, right? And concepts around those ideas. See, because all of this is rooted in ideas about law and order. And you might hear people who say, well, I'm against police brutality. But when you start talking about defunding police, you really then see the breakdown that happens. And so even a lot of the people who were out marching for George Floyd wouldn't be in favor of a lot of the prescriptions that came, right, as a result of it, right? In terms of, well, what do we do about it, right? We see that even, I mean, you know, the most famous Black American in the world is Barack Obama. He don't support defund the police. He called it a silly idea, right? That isn't helpful. But you see, well, on the other hand, there's a large segment of the community who are in favor of talking about. So I only bring that up to say that, sure, and that was what I was getting at, that there was a great, diverse, multi-faith, multi-ethnic presence out in the street doing the protesting, right? And that's important, right? But the generative work of how we rethink and reshape America is more complicated and takes a lot of work. And that's why, you know, I was talking about some of the tools that I think is important. And so that's what I would say about it. But I definitely agree. George Floyd's death was seminal. Yeah.
Thank you.
I saw someone here. I think this is Rona. I wanted to address in the chat who talked about referring to so-called whites as Euro-Americans, so that whites don't get to imagine that they are real Americans because they don't have the hyphen. I got James Baldwin playing all in my head when I see that. They perceive themselves to be white, as he likes to say a lot of times, right? Perceive themselves to be. So I used to give a lecture a few years ago about part of how we could help to really dismantle white supremacy is to just divest from the usage of color terms like black and white, which is a whole conversation. But I think part of what we're getting at, and I heard when President Ray, when you were talking, this came back up to you were talking about land and people coming from home, is that, you know, the truth of the matter is, like in the Bible, you knew people by ethnos, you knew them by where they originated from. You knew them by the land of the place that they came from, right? And to your point, I do think, and I've always thought it would be helpful. I don't know that it's possible because I think we're so entrenched in these color coding, but I do think it would be helpful to start referring to people by the land from which their heritage emanates from in some ways, right? Like Euro-American, you know, African-American. I like these terms, Caribbean-American. My wife is from the Caribbean and she's very clear. And the reason why I know this to be helpful is because there are ways that she sometimes wants to separate herself out from those of us who were born here as Black, you know, African-Americans here in this country, to say, well, there's parts of the struggle I don't identify with as a Caribbean-American person, right, who's immigrated here, right? And so I do think getting back to some of these ideas about associations with land and heritage could be helpful, instead of continually buying into the bankrupt notions of this color coding that's rooted in human divisions. But that's a hard lift. But I thank you for putting in the chat. Yeah.
May I make a comment to that?
Yeah.
Can we,
You know, John,
can we get another, because we only have time for one more. So could we get another speaker? I didn't want to cut you off, but I want to make sure we have an opportunity for at least one other person before we close.
I just had a very quick comment about the using Euro-American or something like that. Yeah, it's a Band-Aid at best. I hear you on that, Billy, but also maybe helps to remind, I mean, some of us who are Euro-Americans have only been here for 2 or 3 generations. You know, most of the African-American community has been here for 6, 8, you know, not even able to tell how many generations. And it really, to a certain extent, might be just another subtle reminder. And sometimes you got to slide it under the door for, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, for folks who look like me, you got to slide it under the door to remind them that they don't own this place. And half of them haven't been here all that long, and remind them that they come from somewhere else too. So.
Yeah, I'll say very quickly, President Rand, turn it back over to you. I mean, I think some denominations have been rightfully dealing with this in terms of the ways in which they created these doctrines once upon a time of folks who were first here, that were, these theologies were used as ways to really help to justify the slaughtering of Native Amerindian people. So I do think that part of what you're getting at also helps to correct the narrative around this, you know, whose country is this type of narrative. Still to this day, right now, we may, in 2021, we may get the first Native American or Indigenous American serving in a presidential cabinet. We've still never had one serve in a presidential cabinet. We may get one this time with the Biden administration, may. And so that's part of that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about, and even this idea of America's first sin being enslavement of African people. Not true, right? The America's first sin was the slaughter of Native American Amerindian folks, right? That's the first sin of America. So I think that could be helpful also in this work to just correct the narrative, if nothing else.
Well, I think I want to begin to use you, Reverend Anna, as a poster child in terms of this is what good theological education can do for you. So I want to thank you for bringing certainly one of the most astute and meaningful engagements that we've had with the actual work and activism on the street, connecting it to some of the deep theological traditions that can inspire and provide us some hope. So I want to thank you for that. Thank you for being with us, and glad that you have joined our circle, because I just want to be clear, if you think that we're going to let you go after the end of this conversation, you are mistaken. You're part of our circle now. So we thank God for that.